Good evening, everyone. Ali Caldwell has given me the word that it's time to start. Very nice to see you all. My name is Claire Zimmerman. I am a faculty member here at the Daniels faculty and currently the director of the PhD program in Architecture, Landscape, and Design. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome our speaker tonight, Professor Ted Jojola. But first, at the Daniels faculty or at U of T in general, we read a land acknowledgement. Like many people, I'm a little bit wary of the performativity of land acknowledgements, but the land acknowledgement can also be seen, I think, as part of a long oral tradition, which Canadian First Nations writer Bobby Lee Miracle described as, quote, learning through oratory. So each time I deliver a land acknowledgement, I try to learn something new about the place where I am before I orate it. Here goes. We wish to acknowledge this sacred land on which the University of Toronto operates. It has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. The territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. Welcome, Professor Jojola, Castoseraguate, Paulette Moore, Indigenous advisors, allies, particularly on landscape architecture colleagues, Daniels students, faculty, staff, and members of our community. Professor Jojola is Distinguished and Regents Professor and the founding director of the Indigenous Design and Planning Institute at the University of New Mexico, which opened in 2012. IDPI, as it is known, combines work with tribal communities, community development activism, and academic research on Indigenous building practices, as exemplified by Ted's extensive publishing record. In addition to many articles and papers, he is co-editor of 2 books, The Native American Philosophy of V.F. Cordova, entitled How It Is, from the University of Arizona Press in 2007, and Reclaiming Indigenous Planning from the McGill Queen's University Press in 2013. He has a podcast, Placeknowing, that you can find on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and that lays out some of the principles of IDPI, but also informs us about its remediation efforts, or rematriation efforts, on brownfield sites from Arizona to Alaska. Before founding IDPI, Professor Jojola directed the Department of Native American Studies at UNM for 16 years, where he established an undergraduate major in Native Studies. He has been a visiting distinguished professor at Arizona State University, another powerhouse in Indigenous studies in the US. He has a certificate in international human rights law from the University of Strasbourg, a PhD in political science from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, followed by a postdoc at UCLA, a master in environmental design from MIT, and he began his academic career with a BFA in architecture and a double minor in mathematics and music from the University of New Mexico. This remarkable academic journey, beginning with architecture and traversing landscape and environmental design, political science, human rights law, and planning, correctly describes, to my mind, the necessary skills of someone working in built environmental practice today. Ted is currently about to open an exhibition on contemporary Indigenous architecture at the Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque, funded by the Graham Foundation. The exhibition will remain on show from April 12th until the end of the calendar year, and it will be accompanied by a publication, Contemporary Indigenous Architecture, Local Traditions, Global Wins. To end on a brief personal note, Ted notes that the work of IDPI does have a defensive aspect, protecting the life and communities of Indigenous people currently focused on the US Southwest, who have routinely suffered from the abrogation of their rights and widespread ignorance of their ethic of responsibility. But Ted's public profile outside of the Indigenous community is, to my mind, an act of great generosity to those of us who remain ill-informed about the history and life of Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. And I count myself in that group. Speaking entirely selfishly, I want to thank him for that generosity here. Engagement in and understanding of Indigenous design and planning principles is one of the most positive, critical discourses in which design fields can participate today, at a time of great negativity in civic life in many parts of the world, even as this work with Indigenous knowledge reminds us of our own responsibilities toward Indigenous peoples if we are non-Indigenous. We touched on this briefly in our PhD workshop yesterday, where we also found interesting crossovers of Ted's work with students in computation, urbanism, and architectural history. It turns out that the digital undo function and the project of computational unbuilding have a lot to do, or robotic unbuilding, have a lot to do with the crucial concept of rematriation that I think we'll hear about tonight. Professor Ted Jojola is a member of the Isleta Pueblo in New Mexico. His Indigenous name is Sunrise when translated into English, a powerful image name that casts hope upon the present moment, which is in many ways so dark. Welcome, Ted.
Gosh, on this day of our equinox, which is a very special day in terms of our ancestors, wish to acknowledge just the beautiful and wonderful hospitality that I've received in coming to this place. And in my language, when I said Hinumokimam, the way that we measure time and keep time is we have two different sayings for when the sun rises, and then in the middle, and then when the sun sets. And every time I come to Toronto, I never hardly ever see the sun. So yesterday was an interesting treat because I thought, wow, it's finally come of spring due to the equinox, and look at it outside again. And actually, when I was on my sabbatical here a couple of years ago and had a chance to be a visiting researcher at York University, I came in January. I was here for 29 days. I did not see the sun once. And my partner, Paulette, was laughing at me because we went to Tanganega and visited some friends there. And I got out of there and it was still cold and icy, and I said, gosh, it's warming up here, isn't it? Which was totally contrary to, of course, being a person that's raised in the sun in New Mexico, where my homeland is at. So thank you all, and I really want to kind of take you a little bit on a journey of both my people and my ancestors, and then also then move you into some of the ways that we have conceptualized and thought about looking at community engagement from our Indigenous perspective. And we call it Placeknowing, simply because it really is essentially a declaration about how it is that we retain our culture and identity by walking the land, especially from the standpoint of generation, and in particular, how important it is in order to be able to walk that land, to learn the meaning, to learn the language, to learn the context, to learn the stories, to learn all these things that are so fundamental to the way that we have evolved and transferred our knowledge in a way then that builds our sense of being and our self-esteem, and also our notion of sustainability and resiliency as well too. So as Claire, thank you very much for that great introduction, has indicated, we established the Indigenous Design and Planning Institute in 2012. And essentially, our mission is really to educate and inform Indigenous design by planning by engaging our faculty, our students, our professionals, and the community in culturally appropriate practices. And really the mainstay of this is we do this by using our culture and identity to inform community development. And how this has come to bear is by essentially our notion of how we came into being. So today being equinox then is essentially so much of this kind of resonating power that is generated by how it is that we move through time and space, and in particular looking at the notion of cycle and renewal. And as you can see depicted here is one of our ancestral petroglyphs that shows birth, and then on the other side was the image that we saw of the totality that occurred a few years back. So we know that these forces are so powerful and so meaningful, and in a sense instruct us in terms of how it is that we begin to attune what it is that we call traditional knowledge to being able to think about how we relate to the world. For our story as Pueblo people who have inhabited for millennia the area of the Southwest, we look at it from the standpoint of our sense of emergence, where we came from the center of the earth and then now inhabit at what we call the fifth level, the mantle of the earth. And that mantle you can see as kind of a skin, even within the landscape. As you see here of this picture that's taken in the Four Corners area, we then see how it is that we came up, and then with our sense of original instructions, we're given then the task of being able to go and migrate throughout the four corners of the world in order to be able to attain our own notion of who it is that we are. And it's very much part in the framework of even how it is that we look at the construction of our ancestral places and how they've transferred even into the contemporary context. So this is one of our sacred ceremonial areas that's called the Kiva, and this is where our clans come together in order to be able to essentially read, live, and acknowledge the pageantry of our notion of how it is that we understand our journey. And as you can see, even within this particular structure, you see these levels, and all of these levels then are attuned to how it is that we progressed into what it is that we are of in terms of our state of awareness. And when we came up from that journey, we came up in a very specific ordering. We have younger clans and older clans, and essentially it was a sacred clown with their corn husk that's depicted today, even in terms of our contemporary ceremonies, that broke the wedge that then allowed us to transverse from the center of the earth to the top. And once we came out there, then we began to continue our affinity based on our matrilineal ordering. And as these instructions were carried by the various clans and the families and the societies that came out of this ordering, then we began to build our mark across the landscape. So you see the clans depicted on the left side, and on the right side you see the spiral. And this one is very unique in the sense of the fact that it's also a vector, so it shows directionality, because the way that then we were instructed to go into the world was with very specific directions. In our case, it was counterclockwise. And the other thing to note here is that the most important orientation for us is the east. So unlike the Euro-Western standard of north being on the top, to us, east is on the top. And that's how it is that we frame our sacred geography. So for those of you that have seen petroglyphs, and you have them here as well too, then you will not be able to get a sense of that orientation until you acknowledge that it's the east that is actually being represented on the top of what it is that you're looking at. So this spiral then, and this journey then, is to the four corners of the earth. And how it is then that we begin to think about the place that we emerge, which becomes what we call our heart place, is that that journey essentially took us to the four corners of the world. And then as we completed that cycle, then we went back to our heart place. But because in physicalness, we come back to the center of where it is that we emerged, we still, from the standpoint of what we've experienced, actually have elevated our collective consciousness. So that spiral in 3D then becomes flat in terms of its representation, but then in 3D, it becomes the spiral because now we've elevated our consciousness, but physically we go back to the same place, but we're not the same people that we were because of what it is that we've seen. So how it is then that we bring that knowledge back, and this is the instructions that we were given, is that you observe and you see and you learn, and then you take the things that you've seen and learned, bring them back to the heart place, but you adapt them. You don't necessarily take them for full of complement of what it was originally, but you adapt them. So from that standpoint, we've always been adaptive, and that's how we build our sense of resiliency, and it very much goes against the grain of many of the kind of scholarship, especially in anthropology and archaeology, that has looked at us as being primitive and never changing. And in fact, we've always been very dynamic, and we need to acknowledge that in the sense of how it is that we tie that back into our ancestral teachings. So the way then that we build that representation in the communities that we have begun to construct is typified by this image that is here, which represents one of our Pueblo communities in the northern part of New Mexico. This one is Tewa. My particular tribe is Taiwa, and we speak mutually unintelligible languages, even though we coexist side by side. But here's how it is that they formulated their particular worldview. And that worldview is dictated by the boundary, of which then is the area that's necessary, the ecology and the landscape that's necessary in order to be able to sustain the community. And then it's also oriented towards the cardinal directions, which are basically the instructions that we get from the cosmos in terms of orientation and how it is that we begin to place the structures that we evolve and develop. And then by the societies that we form, which are the moieties. And these represent both the summer and the winter clans, and they change responsibility through our temperate climates in terms of the ways of responsibility, because we always remind ourselves that we have to attune ourselves to these things, otherwise we're not fulfilling our responsibility in terms of acknowledging the process that keeps us nurtured and alive through the seasons. And you notice that in both of these moieties, you see the individual there with the stripes. Well, that's the sacred clown that came up, and you see the little corn husks on the top, the little pointy thing, and then those lines that are depicted on that person represent the levels that he had to, or that person had to ascend in order to be able to get us to where we are today. So you see this in terms of even the way that we have developed our vernacular landscape. And this particular World Heritage Site, which is a living community in northern New Mexico called Taos Pueblo, you can see then the 5 levels. They actually are related to us in terms of language. And you see how those 5 levels are also very much reminiscent of the mountains that are in the background. So this becomes an archetype, not just for living and habitation, but it also contains all these teachings and meanings as represented by the architecture that we still maintain to this day, as you see in this particular picture. So we see the men who are doing the plastering of the mud on the outsides, and actually it used to be a women's role and women's job to do this type of plastering. but somewhere along the line we got sidetracked by the wage economy. So now this is a great wage for the men in the community to be able to do this. But nonetheless, it's how it is that we continue to maintain these structures over time and over decades and over millennia. So this particular village is over 1,000 years old, and we have many of the longest lives in habitations in the whole of the Northern Hemisphere. So one of the key things then that we really bring in terms of how it is that we frame our sense of understanding is what we call the worldview. And this one represents one which is particular to my community. And you can see that ribbon there, which is the Rio Grande River. Those of you that have been to the Southwest, I know, are totally underwhelmed by the river because it's not anywhere of the scale of many of the great rivers, especially up in this region. But yet, when you look at it, a lot of people don't understand that you're only seeing 10%, the surface of the water that's flowing there. And the 90% is actually underground. And now that we've learned how to mine this water for domestic purposes, then that's where the grid system emerged, that's where urbanity emerged. But to this day, we still maintain a more temporal lifestyle that's based on gravity flow, of harnessing that water to go to our fields, because we basically inhabit a high-step desert that is very fragile in terms of this ecological relationship. But the cycle of how it is that we go through the years are the snowfall that falls on the mountains, then is our reservoir. As it melts, it goes into the riparian area and feeds then our communities. And then we get the seasonal rains that come in, the monsoons during the growing season. And then we go into the winter time. And all of these then represent that kind of cycle, which is contained in a sense, this kind of global sphere, which of course is oriented towards the cosmic or the cardinal orientation. And we ground this in terms of the 7 cardinal orientations. So we not only have the north, the east, the west, and the south, but we also have the top, we have the bottom, and we have the middle, which is the nadir. And the nadir is our heart place. So how then do we begin to sort of translate this into our practice, particularly from the standpoint of Indigenous planning? So we believe in what's called the 7 generations framework. And this is typified by one of our ancestral sites. This is the schematic, but here is the actual structure itself. This is Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, which is a national monument in New Mexico. And what's so amazing about this is that it's an ancestral site that evolved and developed over 140 years. And archaeological evidence shows that there were actually 7 distinct phases that were attuned to this. So if you do the math, that's about 20 years per phase, which at that time probably was a generation. And the way that we bring this kind of impactful knowledge to our people that we talk with is to say, imagine that those people who began this did not live long enough to actually see it to its final fruition. And what was it that was so compelling about this then that they never lost sight of how they were going to finish this? And in that process, then bring in all the indigenous knowledge that was necessary to build the orientations that helped to shape and formulate this. Because essentially all the walls measure and are attuned to the solstices, to the lunar orientations. You can see notions of the dualities in the 2 plazas there. The kivas, which are the sacred chambers for our clan systems. Those are the wayfinding sites in terms of the celestial bodies. And one colleague who has unfortunately passed away, who was a knowledge keeper for the forest from the Menominee Nation, he looked at this and he said, wow, this looks like the hemisphere of the brain. And when you looked at the center of it, he said, that's the hippocampus. And I said, wow, I never thought about that. And just the other day got a new revelation and said, this is in the shape of a crescent moon. So all of these kinds of elements then became the elements of building this kind of cohesive sense of how this has been built and sustained over generations. And when thinking about it and putting yourself in that position, imagine you're the middle generation. Then who comes before you? It's your parents, your grandparents, and your great-grandparents. And who comes after you? It's your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren. And all of them carry the burden of this process. So when we talk in our planning circles with our communities, we remind them about what that is and what is that responsibility that is born through that particular process, so that we don't buy into this notion of let's plan for 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, because those are all abstract. Instead, what we say is, how do you plan for your children or your grandchildren, or what did your parents think or your grandparents think? And when you do that, then that brings a real face, and that brings that reality and grounds us in real conversation in terms of versus abstract conversation. So that 7 generations planning then is really, in a sense, the sort of way to begin to build that sense of how it is that we build and nurture balance in our communities. Because when anybody asks us what is a healthy community, we always preface it and say that, well, a healthy community are all those generations represented in our places. And they may not be related to you directly, but somebody there has that generational voice. And it's then important to bring all of those voices to the table when we're talking about strategic planning. But then the interesting irony of this thing is that after 140 years and 800 years ago, once they completed it, then it was abandoned because the task was done. And now our lives are essentially the outcome of that, because we're now living the next iteration of what it is that this then had formulated and represented. So you can see that notion of time and cycles and renewal and decline, and how then that fits into beginning to reconstruct for ourselves and reinterpret what is it that then are those instructions that are really specific and unique to us, that are so different from the kind of Euro-Western impressions that have been imposed upon us. Then we begin to reimagine how it is that we think about the places that we come from. So on the left side, as part of a project that I was involved in terms of creating a permanent museum at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture in Santa Fe, our colleagues who also were non-Indigenous, who were archaeologists, came with their map of time and put these kind of linear types of motifs into play and said, well, this is how we represent the ascendancy of the generations of Pueblo people in the Southwest. Well, the problem with that is they identified the Huhukum and the Mogollon and the Anasazi as being our ancestors, but then as you go down that timeline, at the point of contact with this kind of representation, we've disappeared, we've vanished. But we're kind of looking in the room and saying, but we're here, we're mortal, so how can you tell us that our ancestors somehow magically vanished as a result of outside contact? So when we reformulated then the notion of how it is that we look at cycle and the progression of that, then you see the representation of the same structure of looking at the Anasazi, the Huhukum, and the Mogollon, but now putting it into these periods of ascendancy and decline as we move through time, and that horizontal line is that linear time, But the cycle of that as we moved then created different epochal periods, which then represented those stages in which then we began to ascend in terms of that collective knowledge that I had talked about earlier. So how do we attune that to our own notion of mortality? Because we have to remind ourselves that we actually only are here for a very short period of time. We think it's a long time, but I can tell you, at my age, I never would have thought I was going to get this old when I was 20 years old. And now I look back and I said, what happened to all that time? How is it that I got to the place, and where am I in any of this journey in terms of myself with regards to longer cycles in terms of continuity of civilizations and community? So this is depicted by the circle, which is a universal sign, I think, for many of our indigenous communities. And this circle then brings in these notions of cardinal orientation, of color, of totems, of this notion of cycle and completion. And the way that it occurs is that you become that part of that circle. Your life journey becomes part of that circle. And as you move through from your birth to your death, then you assume responsibilities and you grow into your community, and you're nurtured in ways then to assume your sense of responsibility. So in working with one of the communities, Ysleta del Sur, which is in El Paso, Texas, which is a historic pueblo, we began to think about how can we actually map that in a way then that begins to show the life circle journey in juxtaposition to how time itself progresses. And the way that we thought about this is to think about essentially this circle and then being able to rotate it at a continuous rate, but selecting a point there, which is a tangent point, and as it moves through that, and if you mark that, then it creates this curvature, which is a sine curve. It's a very specific kind of physics notation in science. And as we began to talk to the community about how it is that people grow up, then we say, how is it that they actually build that sense of being and responsibility? So here's a depiction of exactly how that works. So here's that circle rotating. Here's that point, which is representing your lifetime or your life moment as you're moving through until ultimately you get to the end and then you pass on. But in that process then, how then does the community begin to instill that and support that journey that you've got? So when we ask them, well, what are these sort of values that are part of this process? And they said, well, when you're born, you learn your meaning, you learn your values, you start learning your language. When you then begin to be a teen, then you start learning your things such as your traditions and your roles and your responsibilities. And then as you get into your adult and you become a parent, and then you become part of the leadership, and then you become part of how it is that you begin to make these kinds of connections within your social norms. And then as an elder, then you become much more in terms of looking at the past and then building the sense of tradition and becoming then the connection to the past. And ultimately at the end, you become the learner. You become the teacher, the main teacher. And then your role that you assume then is to take the benefit of what you've taught and pass it on to the next new generation so that they can continue that process. But the big light bulb moment in the community was then, how do your institutions actually serve, and in particular, what is your role and responsibility to maximize the value and the attachment of your own people in terms of how they attain their nurturing role within the community. So in this particular community, they said, oh, we have a young children's program. We have an intergenerational program for the teens. We have one for our middle adults, and then we practice our agriculture, and that's where the elders come in, and we're thinking about an elder center. And it was the first time then that we laid this out in terms of that horizontal progression, where they finally saw that all of these institutions had a role in terms of then making sure that all these individuals then attain their maximum value within the community as they made this journey in time and place. So this, in a sense, is the way then that we have brought together discussions about why do schools situate themselves? What other institutions then are also framed from this particular context, and taking them out of this notion of being siloed and discontinuous with each other, but then put them as part of this journey of people, and then begin to articulate how it is that that role and responsibility is assumed by these institutions.
Gorgeous. Okay, so what are we looking at here with the wampum?
So this is the passing of the seeds wampum belt. And this is the seeds passing from generations to generations and from people to people. And then this is the seeds coming down and being planted into the earth mound. And it's not just that we're passing along the seeds, but we're passing along the information, the skills and knowledge of how to care for those seeds and to grow them and to save them and to be able to hand them to the next person.
So this is one of our dear friends who's a seed keeper, who's from the Mohawk territory here. And why this is so important, especially within this particular context, is the basic message that she's saying about generations is that unless you act upon it, and in this particular case, by then planting the seeds and learning that and planting it into the ground, and then using this as a way to transfer that knowledge into the next generation, then you are not fulfilling that generational knowledge and passing on these kinds of traditions. So you have to act in order to be able to continue the mode of how it is that this is transferred. So from the way that we've begun to gain our own agency about how this is done, and looking at it from the standpoint of Indigenous planning and design, then we work within the context of our communities. And over the last, since 2012, we've served over 100 communities in some form or fashion. And we've begun to develop our own, what we call Indigenous Planning Toolset. And if you listen to the podcast series, you'll get a sense of exactly the voices speaking about how impactful this is. But we call this Indigenous Planning Toolset Places, because what they stand for are the methodologies that we use in terms of population, methodologies in terms of looking at things around land use and land tenure, beginning to stage this notion of how it is that we begin conversations around assets, how we then develop this in terms of community engagement, and then our role of assuming the expert who leaves the community and empowering the community in terms of how they move forward by building their own internal capacity. And then finally, because just out of necessity, since we get way more requests than we can handle, then how can we tell the stories about this and use that as a way to impact and influence others who can just listen and maybe get inspired by what it is that we've been able to accomplish in these kinds of projects. So I'll just share a few of these so that you get a sense of how it is that this has worked within these communities. This one is from Zuni Pueblo, and it's one of our 19 pueblos right close to the Arizona border. It's the largest pueblo, about 12,000 people, and they invited us in to conversations that were around Main Street, and they're the only tribe in the United States that were able to get a Main Street project in order to look at how it is that they could use their artists and develop their Main Street as a way to promote economic development. In this process, we found out that 80% of all households do some sort of art as part of augmenting their livelihood. So this is a mainstay, and they're incredibly creative. But a lot of this then comes from how it is that they've built this sense of representation, and how the art itself is almost a sacred aspect of how it is that they depict all the kinds of energies that are around them. This shows that migration spiral of one of the clans that essentially follows what it is that I had talked about, this journey that has come in time and place. And in a project that they did about developing paintings around the migration stories that they have, this is the wonderful, amazing palette that they came up with. One of the artists, I should say, they had a number of artists that were doing these, but you can see all the areas that go all the way from the northern reaches of our region all the way to the most southern, which are in Mesoamerica, and in some cases even going as far as South America, and certainly into this northern part of the hemisphere itself. And all of those then are part of these journeys that I had indicated that were part of the collective knowledge that we were able to attune. And this calendar here, which actually goes counterclockwise, then gives an indication of how complex this understanding is. And when we began to map this out with their assistance, we found out that out of the 360 odd days of the year that we have, only about 30 days of those were they not involved in some sort of ceremony or in some sort of process within their own particular community. And this brought in just tremendous levels of responsibility for every family, for every individual, so they were hardly ever idle from the standpoint of how it is that they attune themselves to this. And we worked with them to say, okay, so your community has changed over time. Now, how would you actually characterize it? And we actually used that migration etching or the petroglyph that was there and created a timeline for them. And this is the way that it ultimately got depicted. So you see the circle, and then you see that emergence that comes out of there, and then as they move through that, then where you see that first set of little circles that are there, that's the point of contact. And then the changes as they began to occur more in frequency comes more and more within the sort of modern time frame, and that then, in a sense, represents how rapid the change is increasing from that point. So taking all of these and understanding what change means and how it is then that we can get back to the heart place, because their other conversation is how can we protect this sacred place within our community, even though we have now a state highway that's going into it and we have all this kind of development. A large amount of our focus then also shifted to developing the codes and the standards of how to use cultural assets as a way then to control the style of development until it gets into what they consider their Halona historic district, their heart place, as a way in order to be able to maintain the streetscape and maintain it in a way that was respectful and protective of this center area. So another project that also I wanted to share is one that I was involved in as a cultural expert with an architectural firm from Phoenix called Studio Ma, and they had heard about the things that we were looking at in terms of indigenous design, and they basically said, so you guys are the expert in indigenous design. How do you actually apply it in practice, and would you partner with us on a project that was intended to help build what was to become the Native American Cultural Center at Northern Arizona University. And this is the final building here that you see. But what was kind of interesting about this is that they had put themselves in a logjam. They had not been able to move this conversation of creating a center for indigenous people on their campus. And this is a conversation that had gone on for 2 decades, for 20 years. And our kind of task was, how do we break that log jam and bring it into fruition? And the way that we began the conversation was to start with place and to say, where is it that this place is inhabited? And who has gone through here through all this millennia? And looking at it from the standpoint of the high plateau, the Colorado Plateau, then what is it then that nurtured the people, and why did some stay and why did they not stay? And how then can you explain and bring that sense of that movement and learning into this community? So we staged a number of conversations with people in order to begin to build that kind of discussion about what is it that they understand about what they know about that place. And we asked them to essentially draw their symbol of migration. What is it that you then depict in terms of your drawings that you can tell the story about what you understand about people who have moved here and who have moved out? So you see the elements of this, such as the spiral, the heart place. You also see the river, and you see then the people that are traversing down the river. And then you see the handprints of the ancestors of the petroglyph sites that have been put there in time and place. But as a Pueblo person, I had always thought of migration as being a positive thing until one of the students drew this particular picture, who was Dene, Navajo, and basically said, well, we were forcibly removed by Kit Carson in the 1860s. And we were forcibly removed to the Bosque Redondo, which was hundreds and hundreds of miles, with the intent of getting us to perish in this barren landscape. But we finally were able to come back in that journey, and it was called the Trail of Tears, and you can see that teardrop, which is how she depicted it. And she says, and when we finally returned back to our homeland, it was that eagle and that was the guide that brought us back to this place. So all these elements then became essentially the thematic components of this building. And these themes were ancestors and emergence, life journeys, rivers, time and place. And it was then our task in order to be able to take this and turn it into form and design. And one of the main instructions that came from the regents there was they said, whatever you guys do, we do not want a literal interpretation of a hogan, of a Pueblo house, of a wickiup, because we have over 150 indigenous tribes or groups that are here as our student body, and we want them to come to a place that they feel is home. So how do you accomplish that? So we took these same ideas of how you build these orientations around the heart place, and what is it that are the elements that are part of that spiritual progression, and then how is that landscape integrated into the body of the construction as well too, and then begin to form this as a way, as a metaphorical way of being able to tell the stories of all peoples that are coming into this place. And in the process of doing these kind of meetings, we had over 20 meetings with faculty and students and community groups. At one of those community groups, a Navajo medicine man came to attend and listen. And when we explained to him what it is that people were interpreting in terms of migration, he said, he said, we have a song for migration. It's part of our spiritual journey song. He says, I can't sing the whole thing for you because it would take a couple of days to go through the thing, but I will sing the part that deals with migration. So he sang that, and we had, as part of our design committee, an ethnomusicologist who had developed a new way of actually representing musical notation. And when he listened to that song and translated it into musical notation, and then the designers then worked with the ethnomusicologist, then it became a literal interpretation with those louvers on the top of that building. That is actually that musical notation of that migration song that's integrated into the building. So you can see just how impactful and how that then resonates with this. So the long short of this is that 20 years of a log jam, we were able to carry that conversation to fruition. And between the time we started and when the building was actually dedicated, it was 2.5 years. So that's how we got through that impasse, by bringing all of that meaning to bear within that process. And here are some of the elements within that building. An elder consultation room on the upper left. You can see then the hallways there and the texturing there, which represents these river meandering parts of the geology. And then you can see in the center room the stair steps that note that migration and that spiraling of going from the earth to the sky. And then on the top is a scrim. And that scrim, then you can change the lighting on it so that you can reflect the moods of sunrise and sunset in creating the ambience within that particular space. Another one that I wanted to share to you was a project that we just completed, Round Rock Trading Post. This is one that we've been doing over the last 4 years, and we were able to integrate all of our programs in the school. It started out with a planning studio, it went into a landscape studio, and then it went into an architecture studio. And this particular project was an old trading post that unfortunately had been burned to the ground. And it was the center point of the community, which is a Navajo chapter house. And in there, the question became, did they want to repurpose this site? And because it was a brownfield site, then what is it that they were going to do once they cleaned the contamination of this particular area? And what were they thinking about its role and its purpose, and in terms of thinking about how it integrated into serving the community? So this is the site. And we began through this process that integrated all these different factors in. Of course, looking at mapping and ideas, how we began to formulate drafting a vision, the site remediation, how we dealt with the architectural study as part of these studio processes that we were going through. And using then Placeknowing as a way to understand how is it that it served its functionality within the community. And we found that it has such a rich and deep meaning in the community, and nurtured all sorts of things, from sort of social events to represented sheep shearing, and also they had a wheat mill there, and then that's where they got their commodities, and it became sort of this community center place. And once it finally was abandoned for a while, and then was burned to the ground inadvertently, then they lost that notion of their center. So our task was to say, then if you really want to bring it back and repurpose it, then what is it that you want to see put into the vitality of this particular place? The challenges, of course, were there. They had to overcome these. They're still now in the process of getting the funding to actually remediate the site. But ultimately, they'll then turn it into a new design with repurposing kinds of elements in a community that is also very rich in terms of its arts traditions. And in fact, many of the most famous families of silversmiths are within this particular area. And not only can it be a makerspace for them, but it can also serve the types of things that were originally accessed, from their post office to groceries to water, to all these types of things, to bring that kind of center activity and turn this back into a hive for them in terms of centering their sense of community. I wanted to mention this as kind of a way for you all to sort of think about the stories that you can hear as part of our podcast series. This last one, we have a 6-part series. The last one is about this amazing museum called the First Americans Museum in Oklahoma. It's not one of our projects, but because we were partnering with Kansas State University and their tribal technical assistance to Brownfields project, we were made aware and knowledgeable about this particular effort. And it's just an amazing example of the kind of resiliency of community and what you can do when you bring together a force of 39 tribes in order to create the place where they wanted to represent their history within the state of Oklahoma. So how they were able to sort of meet this challenge, and it's really an example of what we call rematriation, which is bringing sacred back to the land, or to the Mother Earth, I should say. This particular site that they were given 25 years ago by the state of Oklahoma was the first commercial oil field that was developed in the United States in the 1920s. So you can imagine all the horrible contamination that had occurred since that point, not only from the wellheads, but it became a dumping ground for tires. It was just totally messed up and became actually a super site, fun site. And in that, then, they began to sort of think about how it is that they could begin to bring that sense of culture and identity back, if not represented by their own traditional civilizations, which were the mound builders of that particular area, and then using that as a way in order to be able to bring this into the design to be able to house the museum that they wanted to construct. So I can't go into all the specifics, so that's why I say this is a teaser for you to go to the Placeknowing series, because this is what they discuss. In this process, you can see Oklahoma City downtown in the background. They had to remove something like 50,000 truckloads, or 50 million truckloads of sand from another site in order to be able to build up this area, which flooded on an annual basis. They had to deal with the ecology and bringing healthy soil back in here before they could even think about being able to put any kind of structure on there. And when they did, then, as that point of inspiration, they used the Chickasaw grass house as the main archetype in order to bring this space back to life. So this just shows the immediacy and just the powerful aspects and the elements of the architecture which came into this in terms of solstice orientation, in terms of this embodiment of relationship to the earth, to the sky. And you can see that big dome in the background, which is that Chickasaw Lodge. It just began to be a place that was representing the Hall of Nations, because all the 39 tribes then equally contributed towards what it is that was going to be the masterful identity that was going to be coming into this place. And what's so unique about this is that they actually knew the stories of the things that were rematriated back into this facility. There was some, of course, eccentric person that collected items from the turn of the century, but his thing was he actually identified the families that held these things, and they were able to identify those families, go back to them, and say that here's an item that we're bringing back to our home place, to our heart place, and can you tell us the story of these? And as they then told that, then they were able to get the meaning and be able to build their representation from those particular stories. But instead of just bringing them in, then they invited them purposefully to be part of that ceremony, to bring it into that particular space and to be able to acknowledge and receive it in a respectful way. And one of the beautiful stories that came from this was woven head basket, which they were able to trace and found out that it was from the Miwok tribe in California. And even though there were many tribes that were relocated in Oklahoma, nobody ever knew that the Miwoks from California had ever even had a presence there. So they went to the family who still now was living successive generations in Oklahoma. And when they told their story, they said, yes, this is of a young girl who was escaped a raiding party in California that had cornered them in a cave there. And unfortunately for those genocidal policies at that time during the gold rush that could kill any Indian on sight, they escaped, and then this young girl carried her hat, and that's the one that had been brought back and rematriated into this community. What a powerful, objective story. And when people are allowed, in order to be able to lend their own ideas and their voice and their stories, and then be able to tell it to not just themselves, but to anybody who can learn from how it is that we represent that. So Placeknowing then is really the sum of what it is that journey is for ourselves, in terms of how it is that we then begin to think about the places, and in particular, how it is that we not only have inherited, but how we build our understanding, and how then we occupy our places, and how then that journey is really represented by walking the land as being a necessary part of being able to sustain that particular identity. But with the caution that it doesn't mean that we have to go back to our lifestyle of the past, because we are adaptive, we're resilient, that's our trademark. But that it means that that adaptation and the innovation which comes for that is essentially what revitalizes our culture, and in particular how it is that we meet the kinds of things that have occurred that have, I like to say, tried to transform us into the other. So the final thing I want to leave you with is essentially another project that shows how values can change that conversation in a dramatic and meaningful way. One of my students who I mentored essentially took this to task in the community that she was working in and developed this process called Pueblo analysis. And the way that she did this was to sort of challenge this notion of how planners themselves go about engaging with community through the SWOT method. I'm sure some of you are very familiar with this. It's a process which looks at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and builds conversation around each of those particular elements. Categorically, most times that this has been tried to apply in our Indigenous communities, it hasn't gone very far. It hasn't been very meaningful. And instead, then, working within the community and looking at it more from the standpoint of their values, how do they build that narrative as based on the process of communicating and engaging using those value sets from the community itself, because this is a Pueblo. And as Pueblo, then the P stands for painting, because essentially we're visual learners, and it's as seen by the project at Northern Arizona University. You then work with them to draw something, and then from that drawing, then they can develop the narrative. They're not necessarily can deal with it by writing things down, or necessarily in terms of just abstractly saying, well, what do you think about this? But when they draw, then they can bring out that meaning in a much more forceful way, and also a way that gives everybody the ability to take their own time to be able to tell what it is. So that's what we call as P as narrative. And then as origin, because again, our belief is that we come from the underneath. So what are those original instructions then that we have to remind ourselves about the kind of challenges that we face within a community, because we're going to have to go back to those in order to be able to weigh those forward. And then the E stands for East, because in the beginning, then as a sacred direction, then we say that east as a sacred direction then gives us this notion of renewal. So now let's begin to talk about this issue in terms of how do we renew ourselves from the situation that we're at now. And then from the standpoint of B and attaining balance, then how do we build this notion of healthy community? How do we take all these elements that we're talking about and then be able to bring them into a force for reckoning in order to get to that attainment of bringing balance back? And then M, or L, I should say, in terms of love, because we're matriarchal communities. As the mother gives unconditional love. So then building that sense of belonging, this attitude that a way then is indicative of how it is that we nurture our communities, then we build that structure and that conversation there. And then finally, once we build consensus and once we bring out kinds of solution sets, then we basically deal with offerings. And in this particular case, through ceremony, because that's how we make our compacts. We don't sign things, but we participate in ceremony. And that ceremony then essentially brings that consensus to life, because that's where we then exercise our obligation of how it is that we're going to assume our role and responsibility in going forward. So lastly, because we are a school of architecture and planning, and because we are an institute that works through a particular process, we attend to growing our own, so to speak, and we have to then work with our people in order to change their mind and their framework of what it is that they see themselves in terms of their positionality. And these are the tenets that we have then drawn forward. We're not minorities, because we are stewards of our homelands and our territories and our heart place. And from that standpoint, we don't want to get into this notion of big fish and little fish just because there's a large populous community beside you. It doesn't lessen your own representation in terms of this population size that you may represent. And from that standpoint, then, we also don't suffer from cultural amnesia, because the strength of who it is that we are is what we know about ourselves. It's that place knowing. And that's what we bring into the conversation and into our protocols. So that's why, as Indigenous people, oftentimes the first things that we relate is who our clans are, because that establishes our matrilineal relationship to one another. And it also then essentially tells us who it is that we are and where it is that we came from and what is it then that is our relationship to one another. And then the other one is no translators, because our role is to be able to bring our people up and be able to get the best credentials, and also to acknowledge those that already have their own traditional leadership credentials and be able to voice their ways without having somebody come in and translate and say, this is what I heard. No, we're saying it in the way that we are, and it's proof enough in order to carry the agency that we have in terms of its worth and its value without going through translation. And then finally, the biggest is the attitude adjustment that we need in terms of how we engage with the community, and that is people are beautiful already. Because in all of these processes that I've gone through very quickly, we always go into it from the standpoint of framing it from the positive side. So we say, for example, with the asset mapping that we do, draw the places that you love. Draw the most beautiful places that you have, and let's talk about those. Let's discuss those. Well, what are the most important things that you value within your community? Let's talk about those, and let's bring those forward. And then we say, then what are the challenges that go against those, and how can we use our positive ways in order to be able to meet that? So different from what it is that we often have in a Euro-Western conference, where they basically come in and tell us that we're bankrupt, or that we're nothing but wayward folks, or that we have all these challenges of, disease and addiction and so on and so forth. Nobody wants to hear that. If you want to shut down a conversation, tell the person that they're not worth it. and they're not worthy, that they're not worth themselves. So that notion of the people are beautiful already builds on the strengths of the values of the things that are important and that they actually love. So we continue to tread forward. I want to acknowledge my partner, Paulette, who has been the producer of our podcast series, and she's working steadfastly. She should be back at the hotel working on the next podcast. We're launching our new podcast in a couple of months, and this one is going to be telling stories of the resiliency of communities in the Four Corners from an episode that occurred with the Gold King mine spill that contaminated the San Juan Basin, and the way that these agriculture communities built a sense of resiliency around that. So this will be a 4-part series, so watch out for that in the next couple of months. We also personally have taken on another project that we call Juanita's Hornos, which are basically acknowledging our ancestral house that I grew up in, that I've now inherited, and that we're now turning into a place that the community can share for media, for language, and for instruction. And we just completed this amazing, beautiful mural. The centerpiece of that is my mother, a picture that was taken of her in the 1940s, and all the things then that are attached to this riparian thing, which is what's traced in the background as well too. And then next, we have the soft opening if you want to come back with me on Tuesday for this new exhibit on contemporary Pueblo architecture that we call Restoring Our Heart Places. And this building that you see here found as those is found in Chaco in terms of lunar orientations and solstice orientations, in terms of progression, in terms of values, in terms of staging for little people as opposed to adults, and building these kinds of maps on the floor that represent the sacred geography. All of those elements are contained in there. And the most amazing thing is she took that thesis and then manifested it into this design. That's what we want. That's what we want to accomplish. That's our measure of success. So, what does it mean for the future? Depicted by this 11-year-old child from one of our Pueblo communities. He nailed it. He said, here's the diagonal, and that diagonal represents the choices that we make. And if we make the correct choices to appreciate and acknowledge our ancestral wisdom, then we will continue to be verdant, as seen on the upper left-hand side. If we don't, and we go towards individualism and capitalism and commercialism, such as represented by that casino, then we denude our environment and become a wasteland even that much more. So this is Growing Our Own. These are young people who now all are professionals. They actually did the ceremonial prayer for the groundbreaking of our architecture building way back in 2004. So it was a place that began on a very spiritual foundation. And what more can you ask? And this is me, and how you can get in contact with me. Of course, you know, we will be more than happy in order for you not just to go to our website, listen to our Placeknowing series, but contact us in order to be able to get more information about what it is that we are made of and what it is that we do, what it is that we do. So, so thank you all very much, and I hope that this resonated with you in some way, that you have some takeaway from the things that we've shared with you tonight, because it's just not me, it's our ancestors that are talking through this process as well too. So thank you very much. Okay. Sure. Great, thanks. I think I dropped something here.
Thank you, Ted, so much. We are going to have a brief Q&A, and there'll be time for the audience to ask questions as well, but we thought we would start with Julian Todd, a third-year undergraduate student in architectural studies from southern Alberta of Jamaican and Métis descent, and the co-president of the U of T Indigenous Students Association today. And then Trina Moyan, who's an artist and activist, a member of the Daniels Faculty Indigenous Advisory Group, a co-founder of the Toronto-based Bell and Bernard, a First Nations consulting firm dedicated to including the histories and current realities of Indigenous peoples within urban planning projects, who has spoken widely on Indigenous inclusion and empowerment. And I'm going to just field questions from the audience when we get there. Meanwhile, please.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. It was an amazing lecture.
Wasn't it? We were
A
sitting
lot
there,
of stuff.
We were sitting there like talking to each other through it, like, whoa, what are we hearing here? It's so beautiful. And there was a moment there when you looked over, that's what I want to do. Yeah. So we were moved. Yeah.
And I think you have such an interesting perspective coming from the community in the Southwest. And we've talked previously before also about kind of the differences between being Indigenous in Canada and the US. And I guess, so one of my first questions that I kind of have for you is there's increasing curiosity about Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous design knowledge as there's greater concern for environmental resiliency within our cities and within planning. And I'm wondering, what ways have you sort of engaged with non-Indigenous communities or larger urban communities in sharing our knowledge, and particularly the 7 generations thinking, and how do we go about sharing this knowledge meaningfully and internationally and in a way that's respectful and understanding to our ancestors?
Okay, the long short. You know, oftentimes we're asked, well, this is Indigenous planning, and they kind of try to put it into this box of saying, well, you're part of some exotic cultures, which are tribal or native or however you want to characterize them. But I have to remind everybody that Indigenous is really very much attuned to those communities that are land-based, that are place-based, and that many of us share the fact that people have lived for successive generations in the same place. And if they do that, then they build their own worldview. They build their relationship to their places. And we have to bring that understanding and that knowledge back in order to be able to reclaim, especially now that we are subjecting ourselves to the folly of thinking that we have resources that are unending, and that we belong. We've begun to bring in these kinds of calamities ourselves, the major one, which is called climate change, and we're all seeing the effects of that now. And if we don't become responsible about the places then that we inhabit, and that we then begin to sort of attune ourselves to this notion of place-based community, which is part of the Indigenous paradigm, then we're only going to continue that folly, and that essentially then will end up creating even that many more emergencies. So this is the perfect time in order to be able to build those kinds of connections for ourselves, because this, and certainly with a lot of others of our colleagues and our other people, are basically saying the same thing. If we don't build that relationship back to the land in a sacred way, if we don't respect that mother land, then we're going to continue to project ourselves into a future that is unsustainable. And that applies to urban areas as well, too.
So I always ask a question that is in and around and about those matriarchal civilizations, because some of my research right now is really focused on that relationship. So I'm Nahiawak, which I explained earlier. So I'm wondering a little bit more how you can speak to us about the significance of honoring the matriarch in your work.
It's all about that, because we're also matriarchal as well, too. And that map that I showed you with the community, the Tewa community, and then all the way that those sacred boundaries were established in the cardinal directions, one of the things that you could also see were all these little other villages that were around there. And we build our sense of affinity and a sense of belonging and relations by understanding who it is that our mothers are, because the mothers are the life givers. And it reminds me very much of an event that happened in my life when I had gone to Peru and went to one of the cathedrals there, and there were some indigenous artists there who were Incan from the Andes region, and they were doing hand drawings of the church and selling them to the tourists. And they immediately saw me and gravitated to me and introduced themselves and asked if I was indigenous. And I said yes. And they said, from where? And I told them. And then the next question they asked me was, who are your clans? And I said, well, from my father's side, I'm the Eagle clan, and from my mother's side, I'm the Cardinal Magpie clan. And they looked at me and they said, you're our relative. And I said, how so? And they said, because we're also part of the Eagle clan. So at that particular point then, I knew that I was safe, that if I needed anything, I could go to them, whether it was medicine, whether it was to talk, whether it was a place to play. They then were obligated through that relationship in order to take care of me. So when you look at how we traverse the hemisphere, then we all established our communities and settlements. And all of these clans then began to evolve in place and time. So even there, we're not homogeneous. We belong to all these differentiated types of clans who have had their own migration experiences, have their own stories, have their own knowledge that they brought to that place and time and space. But then the thing that you have to reflect on is then what is in the middle of these places? It's interstitial space. It's the space that you then move through. It's very much attuned to anatomy, because when we look at cellular structures, that interspatial space is where it is that we get all of our nutrients, even though we're comprised of all these billions of cells that all have specialized attributes in terms of who it is that we are in being. So going through that interspatial space and turning those journeys and thinking about it in terms of going to these settlements and these kinds of villages, that's how you navigate it. Because if you knew where your relatives were, where your matrilineal clans were, you could move to that place and you knew that you were safe when you got there. So that's why we were traveling all the time. We were not static by any means. We still do that to this day. In fact, the big joke amongst us is, if you want to go see the Mohawks, come to New Mexico. They're all over the place. They're going back and forth. They're going through that fluid interstitial space, and that's the way our ancestors did it anyway.
Yeah. As you know, Toronto is it's a melting pot of so many different cultures and nations, and in particular, it's also a melting pot of so many indigenous nations and cultures and civilizations. And I want to sort of talk about your project in particular at the University of Arizona, I believe, where you worked with multiple indigenous groups that sort of had different perspectives of migration. And I was wondering sort of how you mediated challenges of different perspectives within Indigenous communities and with so many sort of voices in the room, and how did you sort of unify and create such a wonderful space?
Yeah, it was Northern Arizona University.
Northern Arizona.
Even though I have an affiliation with the University of Arizona, I'm scattered all over the place. The way that that voice was brought in was to simply remind them that they were also participating, like their ancestors, in that migration journey. That if you kind of think about it, that's a journey that we all share, because many of us come from different places. And when we come to the university, then that's just part of that journey that brings us to this particular end of the world, if you want to call it, or edge of the world. And that when especially Indigenous students, and you confer with them, they basically say, well, what's your goal? And that is to educate myself and go back to my community and serve my community. Well, guess what? That's that spiral, right? They build their collective knowledge, they learn, and then they go back to their heart place and they apply themselves from that perspective. So that was the thing that we used for these diverse students at NAU, was to say, you're all part of this journey. You're all part of this process of moving in and out, and who knows how many more of those spiral loops you're going to be taking before you finally settle back into that heart place. But that's what makes you distinct, that's what makes you unique, but that also is what you carry in terms of your responsibility. That's how we got them together, to agree to agree.
One more. Okay, so here's the big question.
Uh,
For me, anyway. So I've been working in this very Western colonized institution now for over a decade, and in this office here at Daniels for 3 years. So a part of the challenge is, of course, trying to help our colleagues or allies who are not Indigenous to embrace or grasp this Indigenous worldview. What do you recommend in terms of helping, or how do we go about influencing them to join us? How have you done that?
Well, I think first and foremost is to remind everybody that we're all in this together, and that in our communities we have knowledge keepers who are able to relate and explain how these associations are generated and how then they build this kind of unique relationship and perspective. But then just as you saw with Janice Brandt and as a seed keeper, unless you yourself then put that into action, then it's not going to continue into the next iteration or the next generation. So in terms of the kind of collective challenge that we all have, we are experiencing these kinds of things that are now challenging what it is that we've always assumed was going to be foundational bedrock. And I can tell you categorically, especially with the political climate that has now erupted in our part of the hemisphere in the United States, all those generations and decades of people who risked their lives, who gave their lives in order to be able to have us acknowledged and to build that kind of respect, is now becoming challenged, and the foundation of that is being undone. But then I think about it from the standpoint of, well, what else is new? Because our ancestors also had been subjected to genocide, and yet we were able to maintain and build that notion of resiliency to sustain ourselves. So this is yet another iteration of that. And not only now, though, is it applying back to our own people, but it's a force that's subjecting everybody to this same sort of process. So that's why we have to come together collectively. And we're here, we have this knowledge, we have these ways, these respectful ways of being able to build this in terms of solutions. Where do you think the notion of green building technologies came from? If it wasn't looking at that ancestral knowledge and being able to understand the relationships of the sun and the earth and the materials and all these types of things, which were the mainstay of our practice in terms of how it is that we situated and developed our built environments. So these are principles that essentially can help everybody. So you should listen, and you should take that in just the same way that we have done, adapt it. You don't have to take it wholesale for what it is that we say it is, but adapt it in terms of being able to use it as a way to build more solutions.
Hi, thank you, Ted. And I have to mention, Ted took some time today, and thank you, Claire, for being such an incredible ally and helping to arrange for us to sit with our 8 Indigenous students who had a lovely visit with Ted and Paulette today. So thank you for taking the time to do that.
Thank you.
Are there any questions from the audience? We have maybe a minute or two.
There's a microphone coming.
Okay, thanks. So thanks for this. It's very inspiring. And I come from Brazil, where I grew up, like near the waters, and with a strong relationship with nature. That knowledge that it comes from like generations, how we learn how to like communicate with the ocean and the moon, and how the moon informs us about the ocean and all that. So I'm going to disappoint most of people. I'm an architect, but I'm going to disappoint, like my question is actually not about design and architecture, because as you said, I do believe that there are core principles and values that comes from the land that informs like all that we do when we know and we build based on what we know about the places. But I'm curious, because you said you're all over and migration has been like something positive. And I saw the idea you have of like the ancestral coming from the core. And then you go, you learn, and you come back and you transfer that knowledge. However, as someone who has been like moving to places and embrace like my ability to make different places home, when you call heart place, is there any notion where that movement is also the heart place and the center of the ancestral actually moving and building different heart places through the places you migrate? So that's my question to you.
So the heart place isn't any one place for anybody. It's essentially where it is that you believe that your point of origin is. And certainly as our ancestors and our societies moved in time and place, they established these heart places according to things that they saw and instructions that they got about why they had come to the place that they were supposed to settle. So from that kind of way of thinking about heart place as being all different places to different types of people, then we all bring our own stories, we all bring our own knowledge, we all bring our own wisdom to how it is then that we make our arrangements amongst each other. And then we transfer those things in ways then that bring new places to bear, that bring new relationships to bear, but that it's that kind of attachment that then really represents how it is that you feel that you bring your responsibility to the places that you inhabit, no matter where you are in terms of time and place. And when we talk about land acknowledgement, for example, the reason that it becomes important in terms of action is that if you believe in that land acknowledgement, then you also believe in the responsibility to make sure that you acknowledge that it's the homeland of others and that you're responsible for the time that you're there in order to make sure that you don't make it worse than it is that, or make it better in terms of your living experience that's here. So, from that standpoint, those journeys all go back and forth, back and forth. New places are established. There's nothing in time that solidifies us. It's just that from my perspective, in terms of where my ancestors were emerged in our beliefs, we've been lucky that we haven't been removed and that, we still consider that to be our particular kinds of domains. But then everything else has grown up around us. And we have to acknowledge that, and we have to form a relationship with that. So I think, from that standpoint, the idea of heart place, maybe even from the standpoint of what it is that you assume personally, you're carrying that heart place with you, and you build that respect from the standpoint of how it is that you're like giving to that particular place. And it also changes in terms of your own sort of life. Who was faculty in the College of Law. She was also Indigenous, and she said that she had retired and that she had built her own house, and that she was going to have a housewarming party and welcomed us to go visit. So we went to her housewarming party, and she was waiting there by the gate. And she said, "Welcome to my death house." And I said, "Oh my God, this is not going well." And of course, it was the shock value that she was atoning us to. And she says, "Yeah, I wanted to tell you that because literally this is where I'm going to die. And you know what? I lived in borrowed houses my entire life. And this house is the first house that I actually had designed for myself." And she started showing, here's a passive part of the house, passive solar. Here's where the raised beds were for the gardening she was going to do. This is where her art room was. And then she says, and when I came here, then I started to care about this place. And I started to care about my neighbors. And I started getting involved with all the people around me. I wanted to know who they were. So she established and affirmed a totally different relationship than what it is that many of us unfortunately maintain, which is being in places where we're strangers. We don't know who's right next to us. We don't have any association with any of them because we're always constantly moving, and nobody then designs our places in order to be able to create those opportunities and make these places feel safe. And I should say that, from my limited stay, and particularly want to thank James for hosting us here, going up to the studios area and seeing how this place is designed. It's so different from my school because there nobody interacts, because everybody's got their own little cubicle and everybody's fixated on their own computer. Nobody talks to each other. Whereas here, it's all shared in collective space. I see all this energy coming about with all the amazing interaction. And to me, that's the value of sharing. That's the value of knowing. And that's the learning. And that's what you're going to take back to your heart place in terms of that relationship that you evolve. So thank you, James Bird, for sharing that experience with me, because it's given me a really positive note of, yes, architecture spaces can be really creative and masterful from that kind of standpoint. So congratulations, you guys are doing a great job.
We should use that as a way to wrap it up. I'm struck, Ted, again by the particularity, the particular situation of the Pueblos, that they are such an unusual, such a remarkable set of communities, and not, I think, duplicated anywhere else in North America, where Indigenous life has been about being located somewhere, which has not been the case for so many Indigenous people. So I would just say your lecture kind of underscored for me the the preciousness, the particularity, and the real value of the pueblos as communities. So, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you
I
all.
have I have to say something here, which thanks also to Julian and Trina for joining us. Tonight's event concludes the Daniel Faculty's Winter 2025 Public Program Series.
Yes, spring.
We look forward to welcoming you to our end-of-year show, an exhibition of student work, which will be on view during Doors Open Toronto, May 25th to 26th. Thank you again, and good night.